Good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Silverstone, Associate Professor in Presidential Studies and Chair of the Presidential Recordings Program here at the Miller Center. And I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Mourning the Presidents. Here at the Miller Center, we study the presidency in its various dimensions, usually in the context of policy formation or decision-making, or looking at the evolution of the office. Today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to look at the presidency after the president's time in office, even looking at the presidents after their time on Earth. And we're going to do this in conversation with three superb scholars who've made a really unique contribution to the literature through their new book, Mourning the Presidents, Loss and Legacy in American Culture, which you can purchase after the event this morning just outside. It offers a dozen chapters on presidents ranging from George Washington right up through George H.W. Bush, on how we experience presidential death, the immediate period of mourning, and the memorialization that comes thereafter, and especially across generations. The book also tells us a lot about the place of the presidency in American life, the evolution of presidential reputations, why these moments matter, and what they tell us about ourselves, at least at particular points in time. As I mentioned, you can grab the book outside. My copy is fully marked up, so I'm pleased about that. I'm also pleased that the book itself has come out through the University of Virginia Press series, the Miller Center series with the UVA Press, Studies on the Presidency that I co-edit with my colleague, Gian McKee. It's a series that looks at the role of the presidents in a constitutional democracy. It looks at changes to the institution of the presidency over time and the relevance of the past to contemporary concerns. And so with us today to talk about the book are its co-editors as well as an author and an additional editor. Lindsay Cherinsky to my left, who is a co-editor of the volume, is a senior fellow at the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University and a professorial lecturer at the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University. Lindsay earned her PhD at the University of California, Davis, and took a postdoctoral fellowship at Southern Methodist. She is the author of the award-winning book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution, which came out from Harvard in 2020. And her writing has appeared in many forms, including the Wall Street Journal, Ms. Magazine, USA Today, CNN, and the Washington Post. To her left, Matthew Costello, who also edited the volume, is Vice President of the David M. Rubenstein National Center for White House History and Senior Historian for the White House Historical Association. He received his doctorate in American history from Marquette University, and his first book, The Property of the Nation, George Washington's Tomb, Mount Vernon, and the Memory of the First President, which came out from the University Press of Kansas in 2019, was a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize. Matt's writing has appeared in the Journal of History and Cultures, Essays in History, and the White House History Quarterly, and fortunately for us, is celebrating his birthday with us today. Andrew Davenport, to Matt's left, is the public historian at the Thomas Jefferson Foundation and director of the Getting Word African American Oral History Project. He's currently a PhD candidate in U.S. history at Georgetown University and has published in Lapham's Quarterly, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and Smithsonian Magazine. He also serves on the board of directors of the American Agora Foundation, which fosters an appreciation of and an acquaintance with the uses and value of history. So we'll have a discussion for about 45 minutes or so. And after that point, you will be able to ask questions of the panelists. Hopefully we haven't exhausted all there is to talk about. Given what I've read in their book, that's surely not going to be the case. There are cards on your chairs with pencils And if you want to write down a question, Alfred Reeves IV will be able to collect them. For those of you joining online, you can use the Q&A function and submit a question, and we'll be happy to get to as many as we can prior to the hour mark. I'd like to start, Lindsay, with you and ask you about the genesis of the book. As I mentioned at the outset, it's really a unique contribution. I haven't seen anything like it. People have looked at certainly the individual presidents and have covered their death, the mourning process, the memorialization. But in putting it all together, that's something quite different. And I'm interested in hearing how it is that you came to the project, why now for the project, and again, to thank you for the contribution.
Well, thank you so much for having us, and thank you to everyone who is here both in person and online joining us for this conversation. We started talking about this project in late 2018 when George H.W. Bush passed away, and we were in Washington, D.C. and observing all of these ceremonies and the mourning process. And one of the factors that sort of stuck out to us was as people were describing Bush, they were describing his decency, his kindness, his humility, the stability he brought to the world stage. And I think that all of those things were true based on conversations I've had with people who knew him personally, but they were also intended as a reflection of how different the world he led was than the world we were living through in 2018. And it was an intentional comparison to the political moment that we were experiencing, and really expressing a sense of loss that we didn't have that sort of kindness and decency and stability anymore. And that seemed to us to be as much about Bush as it was about the American people and what they wanted, what they were afraid of, what they were remembering. And we sort of started to get curious about, is this a unique thing in 2018, or has this happened before? And do the American people remember presidents in a way that is reflective and sometimes revealing of what the country is going through? And so we set about sort of trying to put together a volume that would explore that from the very beginning to where we were, and got a little delayed because of the pandemic, but I think that it has come out at a time when a lot of people are thinking about, what do we want our political culture to be? How do we want to think about the presidents? And hopefully it will help contribute to that conversation.
So clearly you couldn't cover all of the various presidential mourning and commemorative rituals that we've experienced, so you had to make some decisions. Matt, could you say a little bit about your selection process? Why some, why not others that you looked at? Were there some that absolutely had to be in there, that such a volume wouldn't be complete without it?
So when we started this conversation, obviously Lindsay and I had opinions about who should be in a volume and who shouldn't be, but we wanted to open it up for people to submit ideas, who wants to write a chapter. And so this is how we were able to acquire some, I think, that otherwise maybe we wouldn't have thought of on our own. So for example, Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor often gets very little mention really anywhere. But Camille Davis made a very compelling case that there should be a chapter on him and sort of his relationship with the compromise in 1850 and what did it mean at that moment and why isn't he remembered today? I mean, so we were persuaded, and we told Camille, okay, you're in. As far as the presidents that needed to be in there, I mean, certainly there are ones that sort of always top, the list. We're talking about, the Washingtons, the Jeffersons, the Lincolns, FDR, Reagan. I mean, these are the ones that sort of consistently pop up. Kennedy. So we had a good baseline of the presidents that we knew needed to be covered. But then we left a little bit of leeway for trying to decide who else fits into this conversation, and also, who could be a good foil to some of those things, right? So for example, we have a chapter on Andrew Johnson, and so that's a very interesting contrast with the chapter on Lincoln. If you skip forward, we have a chapter on Hoover, which is a very interesting contrast to FDR. So some of these chapters not only work as standalone pieces, but I think they're good in terms of a compare and contrast when you're looking at presidents who are so linked together, either by presidential succession or because of a close election.
Yeah. There are several themes that stand out in the book. One is the role of party and the impact of party on the various moments, and we'll get a chance to talk about the role of families in helping to craft a legacy, and in cases helping to put together the institutions that help to craft a legacy. And then another theme, a through line through it all, is race. And it's fascinating to see its evolution over time and how it has been incorporated not only in the rituals of mourning, but also in the long legacy of how presidents have been remembered through time. We know that the questions of the moment often inform the way that we think back upon people in the past. Andrew, you contributed the essay on Thomas Jefferson, and you come at it from a very different perspective, using the lens of race. One, it's a perspective that we're hearing certainly more about since Fawn Brody's work, and certainly in the last century, but also through the work of Annette Gordon-Reed. And your role with the Getting Word Project has contributed mightily to a reevaluation of the way that we think about Jefferson in time. I'm wondering if you could speak about that.
Sure. Well, thanks to everyone for being here, and thank you to Lindsay and Matt for inviting me to contribute a chapter. When I was asked to write about Jefferson's death, which is really quite the ideal death for someone who's about 82 years old, who had been very healthy across his lifetime, and who actually has his last words published and dies on July 4th. I mean, for God's sake, can you imagine? The timing is just so extraordinary. And I had thought that Jefferson's death had been explored really in depth, and it has. For 200 years, people have been interested in Jefferson's last words, and how his family mourned, and his legitimate family, the Randolph family, had quite a lot of curating of his memory and legacy, and even with James Madison, whom Jefferson tells to take care of me when dead. And so there's just a wealth of literature about Jefferson and his death, but really for me, what I wanted to do was challenge the periodization of his death, because it's really, for African-American families, of whom there were 200 enslaved individuals in Jefferson's estate at the time of his death, it is the beginning of the catastrophe. It's the beginning of the end. And as I collected sources for the chapter, I realized that that story really had not, and still has yet to be told. I hope to tell it in my first book, out in a couple of years. But Lindsay and Matt gave me the opportunity to think deeply about this topic, which has become my dissertation topic. And so my question is not just only how Jefferson's family mourned him. I wanted to do justice to that story, and not just how the American public writ large experienced Jefferson's death and the mourning rituals that accrued around that, but what happened to enslaved families? How did they experience an enslaver's death? And that story is it's deeply moving and troubling in many cases. So of the 200 enslaved people that Jefferson owned, about 130 are enslaved at Monticello, about 70 are owned at Poplar Forest, or held at Poplar Forest, further south near Lynchburg. We really only know a fraction of what happened, who was purchased by whom. In the 6 months after Jefferson's death, there's a couple of auctions of enslaved people here in Charlottesville. One, January 1827, when 130 enslaved people are advertised as being sold. And then again here in Charlottesville, downtown near Court Square, 2 years later in 1829. Enslaved people made up about 90% of Jefferson's estate at the time of his death. They're by far the largest capital asset, and they were capital assets. And his family were legally obliged to sell, given Jefferson being in debt about $2.5 million or so in today's money. As I collected the sources, there's really just one published account of the actual funeral of Jefferson. It comes 50 years later in 1875. Andrew Smith had been a UVA student at the time, and he writes in the local paper here that about 30 or 40 people attended Jefferson's funeral. We know that perhaps 1,000 or 1,500 mourners were in town on their way to Monticello to attend. There's some miscommunication that doesn't happen. So Smith says there are 30 to 40 mourners. But as I kind of did the math, I realized that it's just 30 to 40 of Jefferson's family and very close friends. And we know that, well, we believe that there were enslaved African Americans who attended the funeral as well, and how did they experience that? So that was kind of the inspiring question for me, and as I kind of dug deeper, I realized that 2 years before, in 1824, Lafayette visits Monticello, and he brings an assistant with him, and his assistant actually has some free reign to go out into the fields around Monticello and interviews enslaved people. And one of the questions that he asks, and he publishes this later, he asks about the experiences of African Americans, and one of them is unnamed, replies, and this is a direct quote, they say, "We're perfectly happy so long as Mr. Jefferson lives," because they knew that his death was the beginning of the catastrophe, and that's what my chapter explores.
Yeah. Race, as I mentioned previously, is a through line throughout the entire volume, and you foreground it. It's not necessarily foregrounded in all of the others, but in one in particular it is. The Kennedy chapter I thought was fascinating. The Kennedy experience is one that we're all probably nominally familiar with, either having lived through the moment or read about it. There's the role of the martyr, which is another dimension of this, I think, which we can talk about as well. But there's a chapter on Kennedy in the volume which looks at the Kennedy experience through the lens of race. I wonder if Matthew or Lindsay, if you could speak about that.
Well, this chapter, written by Sharon Conrad, explores how the Black community in particular remembered Kennedy and how their remembrances are in some ways quite different than white Americans, in that they really believed that Kennedy was killed because of his vocal stance on civil rights. And they really believed that because Kennedy had made a couple of really important symbolic gestures and speeches to sort of get the process going, that was why he was assassinated. And that conviction is in some ways still really quite firmly held among the Black community, including having pictures of Kennedy along with other really important figures like Lincoln or Martin Luther King. And that remembrance is really fascinating, because the way that Sharon explores both of the material culture element, how it shows up in items that people can purchase and where they place them in places of pride in their home, but also how it can be a very tragic moment for all Americans, or most Americans, but in very different ways. And we were talking before we started about the C-SPAN presidential rankings and all the different factors that go into them. And I think one of the more interesting elements of the rankings is how presidents shift over time, where they start, where they end, where they move up or down. And Kennedy is one of the ones that has started to come down a little bit, as people tend to give more credit for things like civil rights to Lyndon Johnson. But among the Black community, as Sharon writes, it's really Kennedy that still gets the credit. And so it is such an important contribution, because Kennedy is such a turning point in how we think about presidential mourning. The funeral was the first to be televised. Of course, most people have a memory, or at least have seen the pictures and the footage of the family going. And so it is such an intensely personal thing, but I think this part of it hasn't really been told.
I thought it was a fascinating chapter, particularly thinking about LBJ a little bit more and Johnson's contributions, of course, picking up from Kennedy's legislation, Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then pushing ahead with the Voting Rights Act of 65, in addition to the other Great Society legislation. But there is this dynamic after the 22nd of November, 63, in which Johnson himself is constantly invoking Kennedy's name for purposes of continuity. He's got to get to November for his own election in his own right. But he makes the case that we need to make good on Kennedy's legislative agenda. Let us continue, he says, to the joint houses of Congress just a few days after, or I think it's on the 26th of November, when she delivers the address. Let Us Continue is on the podium at Atlantic City in August of 1964. But the very process of Johnson talking about Kennedy, 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 perhaps helped to embed this notion that Kennedy is really the father of this legislation.
I think he made the case so well that a lot of people really believed that it was, Kennedy who was doing this work, even though Johnson was the one that was really getting it done. Yeah. So he was almost too successful with that messaging for his own legacy, or at least for a while.
Yeah. There is, and I know Johnson's death is not in this, and we were also talking before about the possibility of adding more chapters later on, or if there's to be an online version, we could continually update, which would be a great idea, hint, hint. And I imagine that the press might be interested in something like that. But at Johnson's funeral, which is a state funeral, and LBJ ends up being buried at the ranch down in or outside of Stonewall. You do have, at least anecdotally, a sense that the majority of those coming to view him in DC were African American. And you have kind of competing narratives here, and it would be fascinating to go back and look at that. Personally, I'd be interested in doing that.
Tell Sharon, after she finishes her book, she'll have to do another chapter.
Great. I'll be happy to communicate it. Let's take a step back first, because we've jumped here to the 20th century, and we'll be getting into we've even gone into the 21st a little bit. Let's go back to Washington himself. Because as with so much in American history and the American presidency, Washington sets the precedent, whether it's the two terms in office, the general norms and conventions that he embraces, the cabinet itself, as you know so well. Could you speak a little bit about what Washington did that kind of established a template for the mourning process, but then also the memorialization process thereafter?
There's a great book on this topic. It's called The Property of the Nation. Yeah. And so Mary Thompson wrote the chapter for our volume, and Mary was a longtime historian at Mount Vernon, recently retired, probably knows the most about George Washington amongst any living person. And she had done extensive research on Washington's illness, death, funeral. And, Washington's funeral wasn't all that dissimilar from, the type of funeral you would see for an affluent gentleman in the 18th century. Of course, at this point, he's the former president. He doesn't like to be called that, though. Yes, yeah. He still goes by General Washington. And he follows really sort of the customs that would have been dictated by, someone of that gentry in that class. He wants to be laid out for a few days to make sure I'm dead. Washington and pretty much everybody in the 18th century were petrified of being buried alive. Oh, yeah. So really just make sure I'm dead.
Hey, I'm afraid of it.
Yeah. So, lay me out. Yeah, lay me out for a few days, make sure I'm dead. And when they confirmed it, then Washington was dressed in grave clothes, and they prepared. He had asked for a simple family funeral, right? Family, maybe some close friends. I think he entrusted his family to do the right thing. And unfortunately, when word spread that George Washington, the father of the country, had died, people flocked to Mount Vernon. And all of a sudden, you see this scramble behind the scenes to try to accommodate. You have veterans, you have Freemasons, you have neighbors, people you didn't invite. I mean, you can't turn people away. And all of a sudden, this becomes sort of this grand spectacle of a funeral, probably what Washington would have hated. And at the same time, as word spreads around the country, you have communities and local governments, state governments, cities performing their own funerals. They're doing mock funerals with, in one particular has an empty coffin that they're transporting through the city. They're tolling bells, they're dressing things in black. And with Washington, even though it wasn't a state funeral as we think of today, the response very much almost feels like something you would see later with the later presidents, or a president who dies in office. And I think that probably speaks just to how big of an impact Washington had on the founding, creation of the Constitution, the presidency. I mean, he was a figure that all Americans knew, and so when he passes, you see this outpouring of grief. I mean, I don't think anybody really comes close. Maybe not until you get the first president who dies in office, William Henry Harrison. Yeah. But even then, not everybody liked William Henry Harrison. So it's very interesting to see Washington, even in death, he becomes this symbol for unifying people. And even though it wasn't the funeral that he wanted, it was the funeral that Americans thought he should have.
And is that something that happens consciously on the part of presidents who decide to make some recommendations, indicate how they would like to be remembered, or the families themselves, or is this just something that evolves kind of organically?
Well, obviously it changes over time. Going up through the 19th century, a lot of these things were pretty much family held, and the families made these decisions with the former presidents themselves. If they died in office, like William Henry Harrison or Zachary Taylor, then of course you have there are many more parties involved, because that's the sitting president, right? That's the head of state. So now all of a sudden you have the military involved, you have cabinet officials involved, you have members of Congress involved. And so those take on a life in and of themselves. And I think there is a fluidity to it. You start to see this pattern emerge with William Henry Harrison of a state funeral, and it continues to build. And then probably what we would recognize today is more akin to what Abraham Lincoln had after his assassination in 1865.
Yeah, Lincoln seems, again, with Washington, to loom so large in our understanding of the office. Can you say a little bit about the Lincoln experience? I know there's a wonderful chapter in the book on Lincoln, and how the role of technology also plays a really important part in the Lincoln experience. Obviously, the technology is different in Washington's day. Communications technologies, transportation technologies, those affect the way that people experience it. And with Lincoln, I guess it becomes almost a nationally communal event in some ways.
Yeah, so the Lincoln chapter is written by Martha Hodes, who has actually written an entire book called Mourning Lincoln, which was this incredible award-winning contribution. And so her chapter is phenomenal, but I think she does three things really, really well. One, she talks about the role of technology. All of a sudden there is the telegraph. So whereas with Washington, news traveled relatively slowly, it was a months-long process. The President John Adams at the time actually issued a proclamation that the following February 22nd, Washington's birthday, would be sort of an official day of mourning, because people needed time to get that message. Whereas with Lincoln, they could hear almost instantaneously. And then, of course, there was also the train. So his cabinet really actually made the decision to put his body on the train and take it through, at least the North, maybe not so much the South, but take it through the nation so that the mourning process could be available to most citizens. That was not possible, of course, with carriage. You would have a spectacle of a different sort if you had attempted that sort of process. So that's the first thing she does really well. The second thing Martha does that I think is really brilliant and is unique about Lincoln, whereas some of this technology stuff becomes, I think, more accepted for all presidents. Lincoln was shot on Friday. It was Good Friday. He then died the next day, and then most Americans, because it was a more observant nation at that time, went to church on Sunday to observe Easter. And so the symbolism of Lincoln dying and celebrating the rising, it was, you really can't craft this kind of thing. You can't make this type of story up. And the third thing that I think Martha does brilliantly is she demonstrates that while we think of Lincoln as a universally beloved figure, I've been hard pressed to find a lot of Americans who don't have Lincoln in their top couple of presidents. That was not the case when he died. He was universally loved for the most part among African Americans because they recognized the role he had played in pushing emancipation. He was pretty much universally loved among Republicans in the North. There were a lot of Democrats in the North who didn't particularly like him. And of course, white Southerners who had just fought in the Civil War had a lot of things to say about Lincoln, and not very many of them were nice. And so the mourning process was actually much more divisive than we would think of. And that, I think, is a really useful thing for us to be reminded of, because we can see how much his legacy has shifted in the last several decades, and I think reminds us that that sort of change and evolution can happen, and maybe should happen.
And another thing that struck me about the Lincoln experience, as you said, shot on Good Friday, and then there's the whole weekend as well of conversation about it, official and unofficial. It elongates the process, and so the mourning period gets stretched to what we have now is what it about is a full week, right, for the more recent presidents, and that seems to be significant as well, given where we had been, not just with the earlier presidents, but the Kennedy experience, going back to that for a second, which was really, I guess, a 3-day experience, ending on the Monday, the 25th, with his burial. You had mentioned the really divisive experience that the Lincoln death generated. And during these moments of strife, during these moments of party fighting, infighting, but also inter-party fighting, I'm thinking about the years before Lincoln's death, right? When sectional rivalry was significant. Death at that point also seemed to not necessarily bring the country together. I'm thinking of Andrew Jackson particularly, but it was a moment for people to express their displeasure with where the country was. And again, in some ways, the mourning moment provides an opportunity for people to say, hey, I don't like where things are right now. And it just provides that platform. If you could say something about the Jackson experience, as we march through the presidents, yet another lion who had enjoyed something of a resurgence with the 45th president of the United States, but also has been incredibly contentious in our own time.
Sure, so the chapter that was written on Jackson was by Todd Estes, and he uses a collection of published eulogies that were dispersed across the United States. So different states, depending on the person who was giving them, very different occupations. Some were politicians, some were ministers. And what he identifies is that there are these different groupings of Jackson supporters who are delivering these messages. And even amongst Jackson supporters, yes, there were some that were, I think, stalwarts who defended Jackson to the very end. But then you have a little bit more of a mixed bag of eulogists who are recognizing that even in a time of very intense partisanship, that perhaps Jackson is sort of to blame for these things, or he certainly was part of that, right? So it's interesting, to see that it kind of flies in the face of, well, a president passes away and everybody just says nice things about a president. Criticism of Jackson went back even before he was president, so there's always been criticism. So it makes sense that it would continue beyond his death. And the case that Todd makes is that, Jackson does take on, I think, more of a larger popular appeal with, with these different works like, The Age of Jackson, Robert Remini, Arthur Schlesinger. These works do make Jackson more of this triumphant American figure. But what we've really seen since the 1950s, 1960s going forward is much more intense scrutiny of his role in the westward expansion, his military campaigns against Native Americans, his role as an enslaver at the Hermitage. And what we've seen now is that there is a much more complicated and complex conversation to have about Andrew Jackson, the man and the president.
Sure. That benign approach, if you will, to presidential death, it seems to be something that we have experienced more recently. Is that, what do you attribute that to, even as political polarization has intensified over the last certainly couple of decades, if not longer than that? Democrats had good things to say about Ronald Reagan, right? Perhaps more so in death than in life. And is this just a feature of the age that this is the way we're likely going?
I think there are a couple of factors that probably contribute. So on one hand, I do think it is a little bit of a human experience when someone dies to want to say nice things about them. I'm sure we've all, Matthew has heard me say this before, but I'm sure we've all been to a funeral where very nice things are being said and you're kind of thinking, that's not the person I knew, but that's okay. It's good if it helps the family, and it, then that's the polite thing to do. So I think that's part of it. In the case of, for example, Zachary Taylor, a lot of people focused on the good things about Taylor that they wanted to remember, his time as a general in the Mexican-American War, rather than his presidency, because his presidency had been so lackluster and he had done nothing to help with the sectional crisis in leading up to the compromise of the 1850s. And so because he hadn't done anything, and they were kind of annoyed he hadn't done anything, they wanted to point to this good thing that everyone could kind of rally around. So I do think to a certain extent that rally around the flag effect happens when a president dies, and it's an opportunity to look for a moment of unity, to look for concepts or virtues or values that we can all celebrate. And I think the need for that is even more acute the more partisan tension we experience on a day-to-day basis. And then I think part of it is also presidents are living longer after their time in office. So maybe some of the intense partisan strife loses a little bit of its bitter edge. People can be a little bit more generous, and presidents can work hard to shape what they want that legacy to be. So Reagan's family was a master at this. They were brilliant at crafting a mourning process that, really positioned Reagan's presidency as mourning in America. And it was, when the United States was in the sun and at its most powerful point on the world stage. And it's hard for anyone to not, I think, celebrate that. And so it became a very bipartisan experience.
And that legacy crafting process, when does that begin? I mean, are they thinking about, obviously it's throughout the entirety of the presidency, no doubt, I think more intensively more recently, but in thinking about how a president is to be celebrated after their deaths, when do presidents start to say, hey, maybe it's time we should devote some attention to this? Or is it something that is coming from their advisors?
So more recent presidents, I think you can actually trace a lot of this back to the Kennedy assassination, just because it was so unexpected. Young president, nobody anticipates an assassination, and you mentioned earlier 3 days, right? And Mrs. Kennedy is making a lot of these decisions sort of on the fly, and she tells people that she wants her husband to have a funeral similar to Abraham Lincoln's, another assassinated president. So from that point forward, there's much more impetus for presidents and former presidents to have a planning document created so that their wishes and their preferences are known. And so we see that then with Hoover, I think he dies in 1964. So he'll have what is a state funeral, even though he's a former president. And then going forward, when a new president comes into office, this is one of the things that they have to talk about. They have to come up with a plan. And obviously the plan is going to change. It'll change while they're in office. It'll certainly change when they leave office, because it could depend on where they go, if they end up in Maine or Texas or California. And it'll change over time as well, because the president and oftentimes the first lady will weigh in and make suggestions, make changes. So they do periodically revisit that document post-presidency.
I might push the timeline back about 150 years or so. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about Jefferson in particular as the meticulous archivist that he was. He could find a paper through his filing system within seconds at a time when, well, in 2023, my papers are everywhere in my house, and I wish that I could do that. And so very careful curator of his own of his own archive, even before the presidency, And then certainly in his retirement, this becomes a feature of his life and something that he actually bequests to his grandson, Jeff Randolph. So that's kind of the original archiving process, which of course, as historians, we look back and are able to recover these perspectives and learn from the past. But he is also crafting his own. He's making sure that his obelisk in the Monticello graveyard features the three things that he wishes to be remembered for most, which is as the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, as the founder of the University of Virginia, of course, and as the author of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. And so I would just push back the timeline a little bit. Of course, he mentions to Madison to take care of me when dead, and his heirs, his legal heirs, take that as a charge across their own lifetimes, truly, and become his own biographers, and they give intimate interviews with his biographer Henry Randall in the 1850s. But of course, what's not remembered at that time, but now we can look back, and particularly in the last couple of generations, as Matt was describing, we can look back and find and recover these other perspectives. So for instance, Peter Fawcett, who was 11 years old in 1827 when he sold away from his family at Monticello, and he's remembering his reaction, and he says, "We were scattered across the country, never to see each other again until we meet in another world." So Jefferson has these three things that he wishes to remember. He takes meticulous care of his archive across his own lifetime so that others may do so after his lifetime. And now we can recover these other perspectives that historians really had not been addressing for 150, 200 years or so.
We're talking about the American head of state here. The mourning and memorialization process doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's also an international dimension to this as well. Any number of dignitaries have attended presidential funerals, certainly remembering the Kennedy funeral. But there have been a couple of questions come from the audience about how the American tradition of mourning a president compares with the tradition of mourning foreign heads of state, whether they be monarchs or politicians, prime ministers. And is there any themes, any particular connection that you can find, conversations between what happens over here and what happens elsewhere?
Yeah, so I think that especially as we've moved as a nation more towards this standard is a state funeral. If anyone watched the services of Queen Elizabeth II and watched the services for George H.W. Bush, there were a lot of similarities there. A lot of pomp and circumstance, a lot of military display. We tend to have less crowns on this side of the Atlantic, but I personally think it is something that we should view with a little bit of caution. I think it is appropriate and right to show respect for the office. It's very important to acknowledge this is the most powerful position really in the world, and the incredibly difficult decisions that go along with that office. I think we should celebrate the really good things that presidents do. So the Emancipation Proclamation should be up there. Civil rights should be up there. I'm not sure we should celebrate people with the type of state funeral that we often see in a place where there is a monarch. I'm not sure it's appropriate for a republic in which a former president, it's one thing if someone dies in office or if they die tragically, if there's an assassination, but a former president is supposed to go back to being an average citizen. They have some extra perks. They can probably, sell more books than we'll ever sell, but we can try. But they're supposed to be an average citizen. And I think that we risk forgetting that if we glorify the people a little bit too much. And so that's something that I hope that this book, and as we, to be very honest about, we are likely to see another funeral at some point in the near future. It's something for us to think about as American citizens is how do we want to treat former presidents? What is the right line between respect and glorifying, and do we occasionally cross it?
And do you think that Carter is perhaps not uniquely, but particularly well disposed to resetting the trajectory in that direction?
I mean, based on everything that he's done in his post-presidency life, I mean, Jimmy Carter and Rosalind Carter continue to live in the same house that they had in Plains even prior to the presidency. You know, he has shunned, you know, speaking engagements and big dollars for that stuff. And, you know, he's written books, but he gives the proceeds away. I mean, he has really tried to live the life of a citizen, a very simple life. And so what he decides will be very interesting, because either it will affirm all of those things that we already know, and we all, we know, some people call Jimmy Carter the greatest post-presidency president, right, or will he pick something more traditional as a contrast? I don't want people to forget that I was president. I don't want people to just think of me as Jimmy Carter, volunteer for Habitat for Humanity.
Right.
I was president of the United States. So it'll be interesting to see what President Carter picks, because I think it'll tell us a lot about how he wants to be remembered.
And that shows up in other presidents too. I mean, there was even a dimension of Bush 41 in which he was very conscious of particularly his service record, and that was such a big part of his experience. Other presidents who had maybe not had the kind of four-year term that they had wanted. I'm thinking of Herbert Hoover, but who was extraordinary in his contributions both before as well as after. Focusing on the non-presidential, being remembered more as the person than the president. This is something that we see again and again, I think.
And that was sort of the irony of it all, was that it was almost sort of like the worst thing that could have happened was Herbert Hoover becoming president. But part of the reason that we know him and we remember him is because he was a president. But you look at the response, and it seems like he gets, there is some from Americans, but there's much more from an international response. Different countries thanking Hoover for his work in humanitarian relief, getting food over to Europe during World War I, and also then working in the different commissions under two different presidents post-presidency. He had a pretty long and fruitful career post-presidency.
And the long tail of presidential legacy as well. And I'm thinking of somebody like TR, who, Matthew, you know a thing or two about. In the contemporary political moment, we have been reevaluating the contributions of not just the founders, but more recent presidents as well. And TR died in 1919, at an interesting moment just after the war, at a moment when he, after he had challenged his own party for the nomination, but who had been largely celebrated prior to that. And there are all of these examples of how institutions had grown up around him to commemorate his role in American life. Some of them are changing. I'm thinking of the Museum of American Natural History in New York, and the TR statue is there no longer, right? Yeah. And TR himself is fascinating, because being a man of the land, celebrating the land, conservationism, the creation of a Teddy Roosevelt Library is going to be out in North Dakota. Yeah. What can we learn from TR's example, or what do we learn by looking at what has happened to TR's reputation over time?
Sure. So it's fascinating, because when Roosevelt passes away, he's possibly eyeing another run at the White House in 1920. He hasn't ruled it out. It would be anticipated then, because at that point, the Progressive Party is essentially dead. So he would have to come back into the folds of the Republican Party. When he decided to run as a third-party candidate, I mean, he essentially torpedoed William Howard Taft. He torpedoed his own party, and that led the way then to 2 terms of Woodrow Wilson. So Republicans generally had a poor taste in their mouth with Theodore Roosevelt. But all that sort of disappears when he passes away in 1919, and Roosevelt is elevated again as a Republican champion. It's almost kind of like leaving out that little blip where he challenged the party, he pushed much more progressive reforms than Republican leaders wanted to, and all of that just sort of vanishes. And of course, everybody remembers his presidency. He was a Republican president. But they don't really talk about that in-between part, when he leaves the White House, becomes more progressive, runs against his own party, and then whether or not he would have come back in the Republican fold, who knows? Unfortunately, we don't get an answer in 1919. But all the different groups and individuals who are part of this process of memorializing him, building statues, monuments, they rebuild his birthplace in New York. I mean, these are all generally conservative Republican groups too.
They buy an island in Washington.
They buy an island, Theodore Roosevelt Island in Washington, D.C. So all these different sites that really tout, the Republican Roosevelt pop up. And I think that's a big part of why his legacy stays that way for quite a while, up into the mid-20th century. And now what we're seeing, I think, with the Presidential Library is, they're embracing more sort of the Theodore Roosevelt, he's the conservationist, but also, he's championship, citizenship, conservationism, and getting young people involved in caring about civics in their country. So you can see more of they're leaning a little bit more into the progressive TR tenements to talk about a new presidential library out of North Dakota.
I actually think that Theodore Roosevelt's example is instructive of why we should continue to be reevaluating legacies, though, for a couple of reasons. One, and Andrew mentioned this as well with Jefferson, as we have access to more materials. So partly with more modern presidents, things are classified for a really long time, and so we can't even really tell the full story for sometimes decades. Eisenhower is a great example of someone whose legacy has really only risen as people have had a better understanding of who he actually was and what he actually did in the office. And sometimes that's because of classification, and sometimes it's because certain records just weren't included in the story because of who wrote them or who left them behind. And the flip side of that coin is, what questions are we asking? And as Matthew indicated, we're asking questions about Roosevelt, about his progressivism, about his environmental concerns, whereas maybe those weren't the questions that were top priority when he first died. And I think that those two evolutions are good and right and just and appropriate. And so we shouldn't view it as erasing history or changing history, but rather contributing a new layer based on what a new generation has to offer.
How are for each of the more recent presidents, for sure, they have presidential libraries, but they're usually referred to as presidential libraries and museums. How are the museums doing in that? Are they asking the right questions? Are they paying attention to these trends in ways that either scholars would think would be appropriate, or elements of American society would as well?
That is a good question. It is a more complex answer than you would think, and it depends on the presidential library. So if the library is in the National Archives system, the NARA system, as of right now, typically NARA controls all the documents under the Presidential Records Act, and so they are the ones that have ownership of that. And usually they partner with the library's foundation to put on the museum, but usually it's the archivists who are doing most of that interpretation work. But where that line is, who has sort of the final say, who has veto power over which stories are told, is something that I think is often contested, is negotiated, depends on sort of the person. And then there are some libraries that are not in that system. And so then they have complete control over what those exhibits say or explore or reflect. And so I think it probably depends on the library, depends on who's making those decisions. And so as a historian, I think I probably would be more comfortable with certain interpretations than others. You agree with that?
we're moving toward the end of our hour. Wonder if I could pose a final question to each of you, and it bounces off one of the themes in your book. It shows up again and again. The importance of, and we had spoken about it, the importance of technology and communications technologies in creating this kind of a communal experience for the country. Saw the role of telegraph, the role of train, particularly the Lincoln experience, but more recent changes in communications technologies, digital technologies, and what these moments, these mourning and commemorative moments are to look like in the future. Do you see digital technologies changing the way we experience presidential death and commemoration? Andrew, we had a brief chat about that earlier. The whole process might evolve in some interesting ways, and I was wondering if you could lead us out on that.
Yeah, I look 200 years in the past, and not too frequently 200 years in the future. But if I can speak from my own experience, I remember watching the Reagan funeral in 2004, and in 2018 with HW, or was it 2018, right? Yeah. Not 2019. I remember watching the television and having my phone out at the same time, kind of Googling who's speaking and what their accomplishments were, and did HW really do all that? You know, and yes, you know, and so I think it's not for me the interesting element isn't about the mourning in particular. I mean, maybe there'll be mock funerals on TikTok or something, but how we archive and remember the presidents moving forward. We were talking about the possibility of crowdsourcing oral histories from grassroots members of the Obama campaign moving forward. You'll be able to collect perspectives from people that have historically not necessarily been collected before because they aren't in the top strata of a cabinet or an administration. So that, for me as a historian, is very interesting.
Yeah. And they may tell us something about those administrations and the presidents that we might not have known otherwise. I mean, the opportunity to use kind of big data in this way and take the pulse of the country seems to be a fascinating possibility.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And I think the idea of having instantaneous connectivity, right? So being able to watch it live stream or see what people are tweeting, or you can like a photo of Sully, the service dog, sitting by the casket, which that exploded on social media. Wow. I mean, it's not anything I think a historian would have thought of, like measuring like a presidential funeral. It's like, look at how many likes this dog photo got. But I mean, people generally like dog photos anyway. Yeah. But this one exploded because here was George H.W. Bush's service dog just sitting next to the casket. And I think it tells us that as this process continues to evolve and change, so will the methods and the means of how we try to engage with or connect with or get some sense of, the historical moment that's happening. And it might be through a screen, and it might be through a phone, it might be through a tablet. But I would imagine that will continue to be the case. And, there are good and bad things to that, but I would say it is one way to, regardless of where you are, you could have some participation in what's happening.
I think the piece that will also be different, I've talked to people who were working in television when Reagan died, and the plans sort of to break into news coverage, because at that point, pretty much everyone still watched the nightly news. Not too many people still watch the nightly news anymore, and not too many people get their breaking news that way. And so I think how we learn about these future events will very much be dictated by the change in technology. And your alerts on your phone or your Twitter feed, or for the younger generation, they get a lot of their news on TikTok. And so who is it going to be that's telling them that? Who is going to break that news? I think those are the questions that will be really fascinating and will continue to evolve as technology evolves with us.
I just hope it's not a chat bot.
Yeah.
I want to thank the three of you for a wonderful conversation. Thank you to the audience for great questions. If we could let Lindsay and Matt and Andrew get out so they can sign books first, that would be great. Thanks again. Have a great rest of the day and a great weekend.